HOA fined me $36,000 for fixing storm damage. The court ruled their fine was illegal. The letter landed on my kitchen table like a grenade, a $36,000 fine for repairing my own roof after a hurricane tore through it. My name is Amelia Reyes, and 3 months ago I thought my biggest problem was finding a contractor. I was wrong. The woman behind that letter signed it with a flourish, Karen Whitfield, president of the Meadow Ridge Homeowners Association. She had power, a rulebook thick as a phone book, and absolutely no intention of ever admitting she was wrong. What she didn't know was that I'd spent 15 years as a paralegal and I never throw away a single document. Meadow Ridge looked like a postcard: manicured lawns, matching mailboxes, a fountain nobody asked for at the entrance gate. I'd bought my house here 2 years ago, drawn in by the quiet streets and the promise of a stable community. Karen Whitfield ran that community like a private kingdom, and every homeowner learned fast that her word was law. She'd lived in the neighborhood 22 years, outlasted 3 HOA boards, and now sat unopposed at the head of the table. Neighbors whispered about her behind closed doors, but never to her face. Nobody wanted to be her next target. My troubles started small, the way these things always do: a complaint about the shade of white on my shutters. Antique white is not approved, Karen told me at my front door, clipboard in hand, lips pressed into a thin line. I pointed out my paint chip matched the HOA's own approved palette. She said the palette had recently been updated. There was no record of that update anywhere. I asked to see it in writing. She said she'd get back to me. She never did. Instead, a warning notice appeared in my mailbox 3 days later, threatening escalating fines for non-compliance. I repainted the shutters just to avoid the headache, swallowing my irritation, telling myself it wasn't worth the fight yet. Looking back, that was my first mistake, treating her like a reasonable person instead of what she actually was. Then came the lawn complaint. My grass was ½ an inch over the HOA's maximum height, according to her measurements. ½ an inch. She'd apparently walked my yard with a ruler while I was at work, photographing every blade. My neighbor Tom, an easygoing retired firefighter, told me she'd done the same thing to half the street. She's not enforcing rules, Tom said, shaking his head. She's building a case file on everyone she doesn't like. I laughed it off then. I didn't yet understand how literally true that sentence was going to become. Then, in October, Hurricane Delia tore through our county with 110-mile-per-hour winds and relentless, sideways rain. My roof lost 30 shingles overnight, and water started pooling in my attic before the storm had even fully passed. I called 3 contractors before I found one available. Every crew in the county was booked solid for weeks. The morning after the storm, I filed an emergency repair request with the HOA, as their own bylaws required. Their bylaws specifically allowed emergency repairs to proceed without prior board approval, provided proper notice was given within 48 hours. I emailed that notice at 8:04 a.m., with photos of the damage attached, exactly as the bylaws instructed. Karen never replied to the email. She simply let it sit, unopened by her own admission, in a folder. My contractor started work 3 days later, patching the roof before another storm system threatened to make things worse. I thought I'd done everything right. I had documentation, timestamps, photographs, and a bylaw provision that protected me. I had no idea Karen was already drafting something far worse than another warning letter about paint or grass. 2 weeks after the repair was finished, a certified letter arrived, thick with legal language and a shocking dollar figure. Unauthorized structural alteration, it read. Failure to obtain Architectural Review Committee approval prior to roof modification. Fine, $1,000 per day, retroactive to the day repairs began, for a total of $36,000 and climbing. I read it 3 times, certain there had to be some mistake. There wasn't. Karen had signed it herself. I called the HOA office immediately, my hands shaking as I dialed, my voice tighter than I wanted it to be. There's an emergency repair exemption, I said. I followed it exactly. I have the email timestamp to prove it. The board reviewed your submission, Karen said coolly, and determined it did not meet the criteria for an emergency. A hurricane had torn my roof open. If that wasn't an emergency, I honestly didn't know what would qualify. Who reviewed it? I asked. When did the board meet? I never received any notice of a hearing. Karen's tone shifted, sharpening into something almost gleeful. The board doesn't answer to your schedule, Mrs. Reyes. That was the moment something in me went very quiet and very cold. She thought I would just pay. She thought wrong. I hung up the phone, opened a blank folder on my laptop and typed one word, evidence. I am not a lawyer, but 15 years in a law office teaches you exactly how paper trails work. I printed every email, every bylaw page, every photograph time-stamped by my phone's GPS the morning after the hurricane. I requested the HOA's meeting minutes under our state's open records statute for community associations. She had 30 days to comply. She sent them on day 29, and when they arrived, something was glaringly, almost laughably, missing from the record. There was no meeting minute from the date she claimed the board had reviewed and denied my emergency exemption. In fact, there was no board meeting logged at all during that entire 2-week window after the storm. She had fined me $36,000 for a meeting that, according to her own association's official records, never actually happened. I sat back in my chair and allowed myself, for the first time in weeks, a small, satisfied smile. I photocopied every page of those minutes, highlighted the gap in yellow and slid the folder into a drawer. Patience, I told myself. Don't show your hand yet. Let her keep digging her own hole a little deeper. 2 days later, I got a call from Tom. She's coming for me next, he said, voice tight with worry. Karen had cited him for a unauthorized wheelchair ramp his late wife had used before she passed the year before. The ramp had been there for 6 years. Karen suddenly decided, out of nowhere, that it violated aesthetic guidelines. Tom wasn't the only one. A young couple, the Alvarezes, got fined for a garden gnome collection their daughter loved. An elderly widow named Dot got fined for feeding stray cats, something she'd done for over a decade unbothered. A pattern was forming, and it wasn't about rules at all. It was about control and about who dared push back. Word spread through Meadow Ridge fast once people realized they weren't alone in Karen's crosshairs anymore. I started a private group chat, just 5 neighbors at first, quietly comparing notes and comparing dates. Every single person in that chat had one thing in common: they'd questioned Karen publicly at least once. Dot had corrected her at a board meeting about parking rules. A month later, the cat feeding fine appeared. Tom had nominated someone else to run against her for president. The ramp citation came 3 weeks later. It wasn't a coincidence. It was retaliation, dressed up in official-looking letterhead and bylaw citations she'd twisted to fit. I dug through the HOA's public financial filings, curious where all these fine payments were actually ending up. The community's reserve fund, meant for pool repairs and road maintenance, hadn't grown in almost 3 years. Meanwhile, Karen's own home had a new paver driveway, a renovated sunroom and a freshly resurfaced pool deck. I wasn't accusing her of anything yet. I was simply noticing. And noticing, I'd learned, is where cases begin. I requested 3 years of HOA financial statements, again through the open records statute, again with a strict legal deadline. This time she stalled harder, citing administrative delays. I sent a follow-up letter referencing the statute's penalty clause. Suddenly, the documents appeared, heavily redacted, missing entire pages, numbers that didn't add up between different reports. I hired a forensic accountant friend, Priya, who owed me a favor, to take a quiet look at the numbers. This isn't sloppy bookkeeping, Priya told me over coffee, tapping the spreadsheet. This looks intentional. This looks hidden. Contracts had been awarded, without competitive bidding, to a landscaping company registered at Karen's own home address. Her husband, it turned out, was the listed owner. Whitfield Grounds and Maintenance LLC, formed 18 months earlier. The HOA had paid that company over $140,000 for services that, according to residents, were barely ever performed. I felt something shift inside me, from anger into focus. This wasn't just about my $36,000 fine anymore. This was about an entire neighborhood being quietly bled dry by someone hiding behind a laminated rulebook. I called a friend from law school, Marcus, now a real estate litigation attorney with a reputation for HOA cases. He read through my folder for 20 minutes without saying a word, then finally looked up and whistled low. "Amelia, this isn't just a fine dispute," he said. "This is fraud, breach of fiduciary duty and possible embezzlement. Can we win?" I asked. He smiled, the kind of smile lawyers save for cases they actually want to fight. "With documentation like this, we don't just win. We bury her." His confidence gave me something I badly needed, hope. We filed a formal appeal against the $36,000 fine first, using the missing meeting minutes as our primary evidence. Karen requested an emergency board meeting to address concerns, which really meant she wanted to control the narrative fast. At that meeting, she stood at the podium and painted me as a troublemaker unwilling to follow simple community rules. I stood up, calmly placed a folder on the table and asked one simple question in front of 30 neighbors. "Can you show me the minutes from the meeting where my emergency exemption was reviewed and denied, Karen?" The room went silent. Karen's smile flickered, just for a second, before she recovered and changed the subject entirely. "That's not relevant tonight," she snapped. But half the room had already seen the crack in her composure. Dot leaned over and whispered, "Honey, keep going." That's the first time I've ever seen her rattled. After the meeting, 3 more neighbors approached me quietly, saying they had their own stories, their own suspicious finds. By the end of the week, my folder of "Just Amelia's Case" had become a folder representing 11 different households. Marcus suggested we formally request a special forensic audit of the HOA's finances, a right guaranteed under state law. Karen fought the request for weeks, arguing it was financially burdensome and an attack on volunteer leadership. But a supermajority of homeowners, furious after hearing the rumors, signed the petition demanding the audit anyway. She had no legal way to block it once enough signatures came in. The audit was officially approved. I remember watching her face when the vote passed. For the first time, Karen Whitfield looked genuinely afraid. The forensic auditor was a retired county investigator named Harold Chen, precise, unbothered by intimidation and utterly thorough. Karen tried charming him first, offering him coffee, compliments, a tour of the beautifully maintained, common areas. Harold thanked her politely and then requested unredacted bank statements going back 5 full fiscal years. She stalled again. He gave her exactly 7 days, citing the same statute I'd used and copied our attorney. On day 6, boxes of records mysteriously appeared, though several key documents were somehow still conveniently missing. Harold noted every gap in his preliminary report, and gaps, in an audit, are almost as damning as evidence itself. Meanwhile, my own appeal hearing for the $36,000 fine was finally scheduled before the county's Community Association Tribunal. Karen showed up with a folder of her own, thin compared to mine, but she carried it like a weapon. The homeowner acted unilaterally, she told the tribunal, bypassing proper channels and endangering community aesthetic standards. I calmly presented the bylaw provision, the time-stamped email and the missing meeting minutes, page by page, exhibit by exhibit. The tribunal chairwoman asked Karen directly, "Where are the minutes documenting this alleged board review and denial?" Karen said the minutes had been lost during a system migration, a phrase that made even her own board members wince. Marcus stood and gently reminded the tribunal that convenient IT failures don't override a homeowner's documented legal rights. The tribunal recessed for deliberation. Karen wouldn't meet my eyes the entire time we waited outside. When they returned, the chairwoman read the ruling aloud. The $36,000 fine was void, issued without proper procedure or authority. I felt my whole body exhale, months of tension leaving me all at once, right there in that fluorescent lit hallway. But the tribunal added something I hadn't expected. They were referring the underlying financial concerns to county investigators. Karen's lawyer immediately requested a private meeting with the board, clearly trying to control the damage before it spread. Word got out anyway. By the next morning, half the neighborhood group chat was buzzing with the ruling. Dot sent a message that just said, "Karen lost." Cake at my place tonight, everyone bring their own fork. I should have known Karen wasn't done. Women like her don't retreat quietly, they regroup and strike somewhere else. 2 days later, I received a cease and desist letter accusing me of defamation for discussing the case in our group chat. Marcus laughed out loud when he read it. Truthful statements aren't defamation, Amelia. This is a scare tactic, nothing more. We responded with a single line: any further threats would be added as evidence of retaliation in our civil complaint. Karen went quiet after that, but Harold's audit was quietly, steadily uncovering something far bigger than either of us expected. He found a pattern of invoices from Whitfield grounds and maintenance for services performed on days it had actually rained. Landscaping crews, according to weather records, supposedly mowed and edged the common areas during 3 separate hurricanes. Ghost work. Paid in full, every single time, no photos, no sign-off sheets, nothing but Karen's own signature approving it. Harold also found $22,000 transferred from the reserve fund to a personal account labeled only admin reimbursement. That account, it turned out, belonged to Karen's husband, Gary Whitfield, the same man who owned the landscaping company. I sat with Priya reviewing Harold's preliminary numbers, and for a moment neither of us said anything at all. This is well over 6 figures, Amelia, Priya finally said. This isn't a rule-happy HOA president anymore. This is theft. Marcus filed our civil complaint the following week: breach of fiduciary duty, fraud and unjust enrichment against Karen and Gary Whitfield. We attached Harold's preliminary findings as supporting evidence, along with sworn statements from 11 affected homeowners, including Tom and Dot. Karen was formally served at her front door, in front of the same manicured lawn she'd once fined me over. A neighbor happened to catch it on a doorbell camera, and somehow, that video made its way around the neighborhood fast. She tried calling an emergency board meeting again, but this time, 3 board members simply didn't show up. One of them, a quiet man named Raj, later told me he'd been uneasy about her decisions for over a year. I just never had proof, he admitted. You gave everyone proof. That changes what people are willing to say out loud. The county investigators, working alongside Harold's civil audit, opened a formal inquiry into embezzlement and misuse of association funds. I want to pause here and admit something: none of this ever felt like a victory lap while it was happening. There were nights I lay awake, terrified Karen's lawyers would somehow twist the story and make me the villain instead. My husband, David, kept a running folder of his own, every hostile email, every snide comment overheard at the mailbox. You're not imagining this, he told me one night, when I doubted myself. There's a whole neighborhood standing behind you now. That mattered more than I expected. Fighting Karen alone would have broken me. Fighting her together felt almost bearable. Local news picked up the story after a homeowner leaked the audit findings to a county reporter named Elena Ortiz. HOA president accused of embezzling reserve funds while fining neighbors thousands, ran as the headline the following Tuesday morning. Karen released a statement calling it a coordinated smear campaign by a small group of disgruntled residents, which fooled almost no one. The comments section, unfortunately for her, filled with dozens of Meadow Ridge residents sharing their own fine stories in detail. Even people outside our neighborhood chimed in, recognizing patterns from their own HOA horror stories across the county. Then came a twist I genuinely didn't see coming, buried inside one of Harold's supplementary reports 2 weeks later. The landscaping company wasn't just billing for fake work, it had also been billing 3 other HOAs in the county. Karen had been running this exact scheme, quietly, for nearly 6 years, cycling through board positions in neighboring communities. She'd resign right before scrutiny caught up, move to a new community and start building influence all over again. Meadow Ridge wasn't her first kingdom. It was just the first place someone had actually kept receipts. That someone, it turned out, was me, a paralegal who'd learned the hard way never to trust anyone's word alone. County investigators from 2 other jurisdictions reached out to Marcus, wanting copies of our evidence for their own open cases. Suddenly this wasn't just my $36,000 fine anymore. It was becoming a county-wide fraud investigation with Karen at its center. She hired a high-powered defense attorney from the city, someone clearly expensive, clearly used to making problems disappear quietly. It didn't work this time. Too many neighborhoods, too many receipts, too many sworn statements stacked against one woman's signature. The board, minus Karen, voted unanimously to suspend her presidency pending the outcome of the criminal investigation. She showed up to that vote anyway, standing in the doorway, insisting the meeting couldn't proceed without her as chair. Raj, visibly nervous but resolute, read the bylaw provision allowing the board to suspend an officer under investigation. "You don't get to write the rules that protect you and ignore the ones that would stop you," he told her. Karen left that meeting for the last time as HOA president, though she clearly wasn't ready to accept that reality. 2 days later, a for sale sign appeared briefly on her lawn, then vanished just as quickly the next morning. Marcus later learned she'd tried to quietly liquidate assets, likely anticipating restitution orders once the criminal case moved forward. The court, alerted by our attorneys, froze several of her accounts before she could transfer anything else out of reach. I remember cackling with delight when she heard that detail. "Karma got a lawyer," she said, "and she's thorough." Meanwhile, my own civil case against Karen for the fraudulent fine was scheduled for its full hearing at the county courthouse. Marcus warned me it might not be simple, even with everything stacked in our favor. Courts move carefully, deliberately, slowly. I spent the week before the hearing organizing every exhibit into a binder so thick it needed its own handle. David joked that I should charge Karen rent for the space my evidence folder now occupied in our home office. The morning of the hearing, I put on the same gray blazer I used to wear during my paralegal years. It felt right, somehow, walking into that courtroom not as a victim, but as someone who knew exactly how paper works. Karen arrived with her expensive attorney, looking smaller somehow than she had at those HOA meetings months ago. Without the clipboard, without the laminated rulebook, without the illusion of authority, she just looked like a tired, cornered woman. I almost felt a flicker of pity. Almost. Then I remembered Dot's cats, Tom's ramp and my roof. The judge reviewed the emergency repair bylaw, the missing minutes, the time-stamped email and Harold's forensic audit findings. This fine, the judge said slowly, was not merely improper. It was issued in bad faith, without legal authority whatsoever. The courtroom was quiet enough to hear the air conditioning hum while everyone waited for the judge to continue speaking. The court finds the $36,000 fine against Ms. Reyes to be void and unenforceable, issued in violation of the HOA's own bylaws. A small, relieved sound escaped me before I could stop it. Months of fear finally cracking open into something lighter. The judge wasn't finished. Furthermore, the pattern of retaliatory fines described in submitted testimony suggests conduct beyond mere administrative error. She ordered Karen personally, not just the HOA, to reimburse my legal costs, citing the retaliatory nature of the fine. Karen's attorney tried to argue the HOA, not Karen individually, should bear that cost. The judge disagreed, firmly and immediately. An officer who abuses her position for personal or retaliatory purposes forfeits the shield that position would otherwise provide, she said. I glanced at Karen. For the first time since that first paint color argument on my porch, she looked truly small. Outside the courthouse, reporters were waiting, drawn by Elena's earlier coverage and the growing countywide fraud story. I kept my statement short, I followed the rules. The HOA didn't. The court just confirmed what the evidence already showed. Karen pushed past the cameras without comment, her attorney gripping her elbow, steering her quickly toward a waiting car. That evening, our neighborhood group chat exploded with messages, gifts and at least 4 separate offers to host a party. Dot's porch filled with neighbors that night, string lights glowing, someone's Bluetooth speaker playing music a little too loud. Tom raised a glass of lemonade and toasted, to Amelia and to keeping every single receipt like it's a lifeline. I laughed, genuinely laughed, for what felt like the first time in months, surrounded by people who'd fought this with me. But the story wasn't fully over yet. The criminal investigation into Karen and Gary Whitfield was still moving forward quietly. 3 weeks later, county prosecutors formally charged both of them with embezzlement, fraud and falsifying association financial records. The total amount identified across all 4 HOAs Karen had touched over 6 years came to just over $612,000. $612,000, quietly siphoned from reserve funds meant for pools, roofs and road repairs. Homeowners across the county who'd never even met each other suddenly found themselves united by the same devastating paper trail. Karen's high-powered attorney eventually negotiated a plea deal, given the overwhelming weight of Harold's forensic evidence against her. She pled guilty to embezzlement and fraud, agreeing to restitution and a permanent ban from serving on any HOA board. Gary took a separate plea for his role running the fraudulent landscaping company, agreeing to forfeit its remaining assets. The judge in the criminal case sentenced Karen to 18 months, with the possibility of early release for full restitution. Full restitution meant selling the house, the renovated sunroom, the resurfaced pool deck, everything built on stolen reserve funds. I watched, from a respectful distance, as a moving truck pulled up to the house that started this entire mess. I didn't celebrate loudly. I just felt something settle in my chest, a long overdue sense of balance finally restored. Meadow Ridge held a special election for a new HOA board, and this time, people actually showed up to vote. Tom ran for president, unopposed this time, promising transparent finances and an actual, published, updated paint color policy. Dot ran for treasurer, joking she'd finally get to use her decade of unofficial cat-feeding budget management experience for good. I was asked to join as a volunteer legal liaison, helping draft clearer, fairer bylaws that couldn't be weaponized again. We instituted a rule requiring every fine to include a hyperlink to the exact bylaw and meeting minutes cited. No more vague accusations. No more, the board reviewed it without a shred of documentation to back the claim up. 6 months later, our reserve fund had actually grown for the first time in years, audited quarterly, fully transparent. The pool got repaired. The roads got repaved. The fountain nobody asked for finally got fixed, and honestly, it looked nice. I ran into Karen once more, at a courthouse hallway, during a restitution hearing I attended out of quiet curiosity. She looked older, tired, stripped of the clipboard, the confidence, the entire performance she'd built her identity around. "You could have just paid the fine," she said, almost accusingly, as if my resistance had been the real crime. "You could have just followed your own bylaws," I said back and walked past her without waiting for a reply. That was the last time I ever spoke to Karen Whitfield. I didn't need closure from her. The court already gave it. A year after the storm that started it all, my roof was solid, my legal bills reimbursed, my name fully cleared. More importantly, 11 households across 4 different neighborhoods got restitution checks they never expected to see arrive. Dot used hers to build a proper little shelter for the strays she'd been quietly feeding for over a decade. Tom finally repainted that ramp railing a cheerful blue, no longer worried some clipboard-wielding tyrant would come measure it. I framed a single document above my desk, the court order voiding my $36,000 fine, next to Karen's empty meeting minutes. People sometimes ask if I regret how far I took it, whether I should have just paid and moved on. I always give them the same answer: bullies count on exhaustion. Mine and everyone else's she'd worn down before me. The moment I decided to keep every email, every timestamp, every photograph, was the moment the outcome actually changed. Not because I was fearless. I was terrified most nights. But terrified people can still open a folder and organize evidence. Karen Whitfield built her entire reign on the assumption that nobody would ever check her paperwork against reality. She was wrong about exactly one homeowner, and that one mistake unraveled 6 years and $612,000 worth of quiet theft. There's a strange kind of justice in that. The woman obsessed with rules got taken down by the rules themselves. Meadow Ridge isn't a perfect community now, but it's an honest one, and honestly, that's more than enough for me. Some evenings I still sit on my porch, look up at that solid, storm-proof roof and just breathe for a while. It cost me months of stress, thousands in legal fees before reimbursement, and more sleepless nights than I'd like to admit. But it also gave me something I didn't expect: a neighborhood that actually trusts each other, finally, for the first time. David says I should write a book about it someday. Maybe I will. For now, this story is enough. If there's one thing I hope people take from it, It's this: keep your emails. Keep your photos. Keep your receipts. Because somewhere, in some quiet neighborhood, there's another Karen counting on you to stay too tired to fight back. Don't be too tired. Open the folder. Start collecting. Justice, it turns out, is just very, very good paperwork.